Hello. Today, first we're going to start with just an EOC practice. So if you notice, the first question that we have right here says, what's the value of X? We have two lines that are cut by a transversal. Typically with these two lines that are cut by a transversal, remember that these two angles are what we call congruent angles. And since those angles are congruent, we also specifically, they are what we call alternate interior angles. All right, they are called alternate interior angles. And we know alternate interior angles are congruent, so therefore it means that we set them equal to each other. Solve for the variable, which means we subtract x from both sides. And we end up dividing by 2, and we end up with x is equal to 20. Remember, a good rule of thumb is to actually plug it back in to make sure that you got the correct answer. And so when you plug this back in, you can actually plug it back in and do 20 plus 40. Well, we know that equals 60. And when I do 3 times 20, that also equals 60. So we know that it works out. Today's unit is going to start talking about, we're going to be talking about writing equations of lines. And there are different ways of writing equations of lines. There are different ways that they're given to you. So the essential question is, how can we find the equation of a line given the slope and the y-intercept of the line? How can we find the equation of a line if we're given the slope and a point on the line? And then how can we find the equation of a line if we're given 2 points on a line? And we're gonna describe all 3 of these. So we look at this first one right here. It says how to write an equation of a line given M and B. Now remember, M and B stands for your slope and your y-intercept. So let me write that down. The M represents my slope, and the B represents my y-intercept. Now we also need to make sure we remember how to find the slope. And remember, in order to find the slope, if it's not already given to us, then we have to use y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And remember, these sub numbers right here, these just mean, it means which part or the point or which coordinate of the point are we dealing with. Well, this means that we're dealing with the second coordinate, the y coordinate on the second point, y coordinate on the first point, x coordinate on the second point, and the x coordinate on the first point. The second thing we do after we write down y equals mx plus b, because remember, this is the equation for a linear function. This is the I guess you could call it the parent function of a linear function given the slope and the y-intercept. The next thing we do is we substitute the slope for m and the y-intercept for b. And remember, this is if we are given the slope and the y-intercept. All right. Last but not least, we're going to simplify the equation if possible. Sometimes the equation can be simplified. Think back to a fraction. A fraction should always be given, or should always be answered in its simplest form. All right. So your slope should never be 2/4. Your 2/4 to reduce would be 1/2, or it should never be 15 over 20. All right. 15 over 20 reduced would be 3/4. So those are things that you need to make sure you remember. That's the reason why it says simplify the equation. So the first part right here, write the equation of a line given the M and the B. Remember the first step, all right? Trust the process. The process says the first thing we do is we write down y equals mx plus b. So that's the first thing you should do, all right? We're going to actually write down y equals mx plus b. Now, we know that something has to take the place of that m, even if it's a 0. All right? Any number can take the place of that m, and any number can take the place of this b. All right? The first one says the slope is -5 and the y-intercept is 2. So if we do it like we said, trust the process, we plug in a -5 for our m, and we plug in a +2 for our b, and we end up with -5x plus 2. For the second one, yes, your slope can be a positive number or a negative number, and it can also be a fraction. It can be a decimal number, all right? Just know that it represents the slope. The y-intercept in this case is a -2. So therefore, when I follow the process, I write down y equals mx plus b. And probably a good thing that you can do is actually label it. Label, okay, this represents my slope. This represents my y-intercept. And so now when you plug it in, notice what you get. Let's look at the next one. The slope is 0 and the y-intercept is 3. This is a common misconception students have right here because they think that, oh, since it's 0, then your slope can't possibly be 0. And I'm telling you, yeah, it can be 0. Once again, what you do, you write down y equals mx plus b. Label what's your m and what is your b. Plug it in if you have to. All right, if your slope is 0, you don't have to plug it in, but sometimes it's good to just be consistent with what you've been doing. And so notice that we get y equals 3, but if we were to actually plug in the things that we were given, you could actually write down y equals 0x plus 3. And remember, we know 0 times anything is just 0. So therefore, that's the reason why we end up with that. Right here, slope is 1/3, y-intercept is 0. So if I write down y equals mx plus b, well, we know that if we plugged it in, we would get y equals 1/3 x plus 0, or we could just write it as y equals 1/3 x. Second thing, how to write an equation of a line given a graph. Now, if you're given a graph, that means that you're given a coordinate plane and you have a linear function on that actual coordinate plane. You have a line on that coordinate plane. We still start off with the same process. Write down y equals mx plus b. And we're going to use any two good points on the graph to find the slope. Now, when we're talking about two good points, we're actually saying 2 points where I know what the coordinates are. All right, I know what the coordinates are. And just to reiterate, remember a point has an x and it has a y. So if it has an x and it has a y, let's make sure that whatever 2 points we choose, we know exactly what the x coordinate and the y coordinate is of that point. And we'll look at some examples. We want to find the y-intercept on the graph. Remember, y-intercept is basically just saying, where does my line cross the y-axis? That's what y-intercept is. Where does it cross the y-axis? Where does it intercept the y-axis on the graph itself? And then last but not least, we're going to take what we found and we're going to substitute them in for our slope and our y-intercept. Now, this is where if you're given a graph, you're going to have to find the y-intercept, the y-intercept and the slope. So let's make sure we go back and remember that in order to find the slope, we need to have 2 points, and we need to know the coordinates of those 2 points so that we can plug them into y2 minus y1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. So it says write the equation of this graph. So when we're talking about writing the equation of this graph, we're basically saying, remember, we write down y equals mx plus b. Well, we know it's a linear function. Now, when we're talking about 2 good points, right? A good point is when you can determine what the what the coordinates are. An example, this right here would not be a good point because I can't tell what the coordinates are. But this one right here would be a good point to choose. Why? Because the coordinates of that point are 5, 6. Or right here, that would be a good point. Why? Because the coordinates are 0, 2. Or I could choose this point right here. Why? Because the coordinates are -5, -2. That's what we mean when we say good points. So I'm looking at some points. I decide I want to choose 0, 2, and I decide I want to choose 5, 6. So the first thing I'm going to do, and let's go back. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find my slope. And so when I'm finding my slope, you should what I tend to ask students to do is I ask them to label. So it doesn't matter which point is point 1, which point is point 2. So if I start right here, I'll say, okay, this is my x1, this is my y1. Well, why is this x1 and y1? Because this is my first point, and this is the x coordinate of the first point, and this is the y coordinate of the first point. So that means that this down here would be y2, x2, and y2. So when I plug them in to the formula, that means that I'm plugging in 2 minus 6 over, and I tend to put the second point in parentheses in. And the reason I put it in parentheses is because if I have a negative point, if I have a negative coordinate, then a lot of times students tend to forget that a negative minus a negative gives me a positive answer. So put that second one in parentheses. And then we do 0 minus 5. Well, that gives me a -4 over a -5, and we know that a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive. Well, what if you decided to use other points? All right, let's check to see. Well, what if I decided I wanted to use this point and I wanted to use this point right here? All right, let's say this is my x2 and this is my y2. And so I will go through the same process. I will say -2 minus 6 over -5 minus 5. Well, -2 minus 6, that gives me a -8. -5 minus 5, that gives me a -10. And when I reduce that fraction, look what we get, 4/5. So this lets you know it doesn't matter which 2 points you decide you're going to use on the linear function, on the line. Doesn't matter which 2. As long as you can, 1, determine what the coordinates are, and 2, plug them in, and you see we get the same exact answer. All right. And we'll go through just to make sure. So we got y equals mx plus b. Remember, we said we can use those 2 points. The coordinates of those points are 5, 6, and this is 0, 2. That means that this can be x1, y1, this can be x2, y2. So if I want to find my slope, that means that I'm doing 2 minus 6 over 0 minus 5. That gives me a -4 minus over -5, which is a 4/5. And remember, we also said we could have chosen this point right here, which is -5, -2. Done the exact same thing. Let's say this was just, now this would be my second point. -2 minus 6 and -5 minus 5. Making mistakes. That gives me a -8 over -10, which still gives me a positive 4/5. Right. So now that I have that, I know what my slope is. I know that my m is represented by 4/5. But now let's see what our B is. And remember, this B, which represents your y-intercept, it's where your line crosses the y-axis. Well, at what point does it cross the y-axis? It crosses the y-axis at 0, 2. Well, here's a hint. If your x-coordinate is 0, then the y-coordinate of that same point is the y-intercept. Once again, let me repeat it. If your x-coordinate, if you have a point and your x-coordinate is 0, then the y-coordinate of that same point is the y-intercept. So in that case, we end up with our y-intercept to be 2. And when we plug them in, look what we get. Let's look at the next example. Write the equation of this graph. Once again, y equals mx plus b is what we should be writing down. Let's choose some good points. So that means I can either choose this point because I know the coordinates, 6, 2. I could have chosen this point right here because the coordinates are 3, 0. I could have chosen this point right here because the coordinates are 0, -2. I could have chosen this point right here because the coordinates are -3, -4. Right? I could have chosen this point right here because the coordinates are -6, -6. So if you notice, I've got 5 different choices, but I only need 2 of them. All right, I've got 5 different choices, but I only need 2. So let's choose this point and that point. We're choosing those 2 points once again because those are 2 good points. And also, we can actually go through and we can say, okay, well, let's label. Well, this is my x1, y1. This is my x2, y2. Now I just plug them in. Well, that means I get -2 minus a 0. Remember, I put that second one in parentheses. And then I get a 0 minus 3. Well, that gives me -2 over -3. And remember, negative divided by negative is a positive. So that's my slope. But now, how do I find my y-intercept? Well, let's look to see if any of my points have a 0 in the x-coordinate. Well, this one has a 0 in the x-coordinate. That means that the y-coordinate is also my y-intercept. Or you can just look to see where does it cross the y-axis. Well, since this represents my y-axis, it crosses the y-axis at -2. So therefore, your answer comes out to be 2/3 x minus 2. Looking at this example right here, same thing. Y equals mx plus b. Choosing good points, I can choose this point, or I can choose this point, or I can choose this point, or I could have chosen this point. All of those are good points, right? And so we'll choose that point and that point. Well, since we chose those 2 points, let's look at the coordinates of those points. Well, the coordinates of this point right here is 0, 2, and the coordinates of this point right here is 1, -1. So I need to find my slope, x1, y1, x2, y2, and now I just substitute in. So that's a -1 minus 2 over 1 minus 0. That gives me a -3 over 1, which just comes out to be -3. So that's my slope. My slope is -3. Well, my y-intercept, where does my line cross the y-axis? It crosses the y-axis right here. What's the coordinate of that point? Well, since my x is 0, my y is the y-intercept, and so therefore my b is equal to 2. Another example, if we go through, excuse me, choose 2 points, y equals mx plus b. then that means that if I chose 2 points, I could choose that point, and I can choose that point. Well, the coordinates of those points are 0, 0, and this coordinate is a 1, 2. So therefore, that means that I get, label it x1, y1, gives me x2, y2. So therefore, when I'm finding the slope, I can end up getting y2, which is 2 minus, 0 minus 2. And I get a 0 minus 1. That gives me negative 2 over negative 1, which is 2. Where does my line cross the y-axis? Well, it crossed the y-axis right here. So therefore, since my x is 0, that means that my y-intercept is 0. And therefore, we see that we get y equals 2. Write the equation of this graph. People, doesn't matter. Even though this is what we call a horizontal line still has a slope. All right? Horizontal line has a slope that is what we call 0. All right? So let me write this down. This is a horizontal line. That means that my slope equals 0. But I still go through the process of finding out what everything is. Y equals mx plus b. I get 2 points that are on this line. I can choose that point. I can choose that point. And so when I look at the equation or the coordinates of those 2 points, well, the coordinates of this point right here is actually 0, 3. The equation of this point right here is actually 1, 3. And so when I label it x1, y1, x2, y2, that means that I get the m is equal to 3 minus 3 over 0 minus 1. And so therefore that means I get a 0 over negative 1. And we know 0 divided by anything is just 0. My b, in this case, same thing. Where does my line cross the y-axis? Well, it crosses the y-axis right here. So therefore, when my x is 0, my y is also the y-intercept. And so therefore, we get 3. Now, when we plug it in, we end up getting y equals 0x plus 3. But remember how we can write that. Since my slope is 0, I can actually write it as y equals 3. A hint is this. If your 2 y coordinates of the points that you choose, if the 2 y coordinates are the exact same number, sign and all, notice this is positive 3, that's a positive 3, then your slope is 0. Once again, if your y coordinate for both points is the same number, then your slope is automatically 0. Just a hint for you. Here's what we call a vertical line. A vertical line has a slope that is what we call undefined. All right? It has a slope of what we call undefined. But the process of going through figuring out what the equation is still the same. The process is still the same. Trust it. Y equals mx plus b. Choose 2 points. All right? So if I choose 2 points, that means that I'll choose this point and that point. But guess what? We're saying our slope is undefined. So if our slope is undefined, that actually means that we will not have a y. All right? We will not have a y. We won't have a y coordinate. We won't have a y-intercept. So let me give you a hint. When you determine your 2 points, when you look at the coordinates of those points, example, the coordinates of this point is -6, 3. The coordinates of this point is -6, 1. Notice that my x coordinates are the same. Whenever your x coordinates are the same, that means that you have what we call an undefined slope. And when your slope is undefined, meaning you have a vertical line, that means that all of these things drop out. And so the only thing you're left with is an x, and you set it equal to wherever it crosses the x-axis. So in this case, x equals -6. All right. Once again, let me repeat it. Let's go through some stuff. We choose 2 points. We label the 2 points. We see that our x coordinates is the same for both. Automatically, we know that it is an undefined slope. Automatically, we know that it's going to be x equals something. Well, what is it going to equal? It's going to equal -6 because that's where it crosses the x-axis. Write the equation of these two, right? And so when you write the equation of these two, you should get the answer of that point and that point. And remember, when we label it as 0, -3, and this is 1, -1. Go through the process, and we get y equals -2. Y equals 2x minus 3. Same thing on the next one. We label our, find our 2 points, label them, and you get y equals -3 over 2x plus 3. Now, how to write an equation of a line given m and a point. Same process. Write down y equals mx plus b. Substitute for m and the point. Right? So when we're talking about substitute for slope for m and the point xy, we're actually doing that. We're substituting in the m, which is our slope, and the point xy, and then we're going to solve for b and substitute m and b back into the equation. So let's look at an example. So when I look at this example right here, notice we end up with our slope. So we write y equals mx plus b. Since I know what my slope is, I can go ahead and plug it in. But notice this right here is a point, an x and a y. So therefore, let's go through and let's just go in and let's just plug it in. So that means that this 3 can represent my x, my y, excuse me. This m can be represented by 2. This 2 can be represented by another 2. And now I'm just trying to find the b. All right. So we go through this process, and we end up getting b is equal to -1. Now I take those 2 things, I take this slope, and I take this y-intercept, and when I plug it back in, notice what I get. Same example right here. Process tells me write down y equals mx plus b. Plug in everything that I'm given. Remember, this represents my x and this represents my y. I plugged it in. I simplify the equation, meaning, let's make sure we understand something right quick. So that means I get a -3 is equal to 1/2 times 4 is just 2. And then I actually subtract 2 from both sides, and I end up getting b equals -5. I take those 2 things and plug them back into the equation, and I get 1/2 x minus 5. Another example. Once again, making sure that we understand that this is my x and this is my y. I'll write down my y equals mx plus b. Plug in what I know and simplify it if you need to. 3 equals +10 plus b. That means I'll subtract 10 from each side, and I get b is equal to -7. Plug it back in, and I get y equals -2x minus 7. Right here, same thing, given to us in a little different way, but we still have our slope and we have our point. So I take it, plug it in, Let's go through the process a little bit. So that means I'll have 4, and I could have left it as 4, but I have 4 equals 4, because that's my slope, because remember it's y equals mx plus b. So I take that 4 and put it there. I take this 4, put it here. Take this x and multiply, and then I just put a plus b. Simplify this a little bit, and you end up getting 4 is equal to 4 plus b. Subtract from both sides, and you end up with b is equal to 0. And so therefore, I know that my slope is 4, my y-intercept is 0, and so therefore I end up getting that. Try that example right there. Pause this video if you need to, but your final answer should come out to be that. Now remember, this right here can also be written as y equals 1/2 x minus 3 over 2. All right, it can be written like that as well. Right here, example, go through the process, and you end up getting y equals 2x plus 3. Another example, you end up getting y equals 3x minus 9. Well, what if my slope is undefined? Well, remember what I told you. When your slope is undefined, all right, when your slope is undefined, then that automatically means that you're going to have x is equal to whatever the x coordinate is. Right? Whenever your slope is undefined, you're automatically going to write x equal and then whatever the x coordinate is. In this case, the x coordinate of my point is 3. How to write an equation of a line given 2 points? Well, we write down the y equals mx plus b. We use the slope formula. We pick one of the ordered pairs and substitute it back into the previous section. And then we solve for b. And finally, we plug it back into the equation. So let's look at this example right here. So we're given this example. All right. We got 2 points. So remember, first thing you should do after you write down y equals mx plus b is label. This is x1, y1. This is x2, y2. Well, we plug them in, and we got our slope to equal 1. We take those things and we plug them back into, we choose one of these 2 points. It doesn't matter which point we decide, it's still going to come out to be the same. And I just plug it in. So I chose the first point. Right. And so we see that our b is equal to 1. And so our final answer comes out to be x plus 1. Well, what if I decide to choose the second point? All right. Well, even if I decide to choose the second point, I would have gotten y equals mx plus b. That means that the second point now would have come out to be a 5 is my y, my slope is still 1, my 4 is my x. That means that I would have come out to have a b is equal to 1. And guess what? Your answer still comes out to be y equals, my slope is 1, x plus 1. Try this example. Plug everything in. We get our slope to be -2. Go through the process of everything and you get y equals -2x plus 7. Now remember, and I'll go in right here, remember what we're saying. I take either one of these points. Remember, this is x1, y1, this is x2, y2. And I'm going to use it in my y equals mx plus b. So that means that if I chose the second point, that means that I would have 15 equals -2 times negative 4 plus b. That means I get a 15 is equal to positive 8 plus b, which means I get b is equal to 7. I already know what my slope is. I know what my b is. So therefore, when I plug them in, that's what I get. All right. Plug them in, and you get negative 1 for your slope. And we get that is our answer. Given 2 points, got our answer. And finally, another example. And then see if you come up with this answer. All right, so that is the end of this particular section, writing equations of lines. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or contact me, and I look forward to working with you again. Thank you.